This is E&P Reports, a service of Editor and Publisher magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing. And greetings once again, Mike Blinder, publisher of E&P magazine. And we're chatting today with Damian Radcliffe. He is a professor of journalism at the University of Oregon, a fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia, an honorary research fellow at Cardiff University School of Journalism, and a fellow of the Royal Society of the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce in the UK. Recently came to the United States 5 years ago, currently teaching journalism, but Damian's doing an interesting study now. He's putting out to the industry a 10-minute questionnaire to get a reading or taking our pulse on how the journalistic industry feels with all the challenges right now going on in 2020, not just COVID-19, which is accelerating so much change in the newsrooms in North America, but also the other challenges we're facing in a very interesting culture. We're going to be publishing the study in E&P after we get the results. The study deadline is only 4 days away, so I wanted to discuss it with him first so you can learn why you should participate and moreover, get Damian's opinions about what's going on in the industry today. It's a fun 30 minutes. I think you'll find it very, very interesting, and I encourage you to stay with us as I go one-on-one with Professor Damian Radcliffe on E&P Reports. Damian, I'm honored to have you on E&P Reports today. May I call you Damian or is it Dr. Damian? Which do you prefer?
I'm not a doctor and Damian is perfectly
fine.
Okay.
Your background is quite impressive. You're obviously very committed to following the trends of digital journalism, and you do it a number of different ways. I was fascinated by your article that I was reading this morning on 231 ways to monetize content. How did you put that together? That's fascinating. And how can someone research that? Where do they find that?
Well, I'm glad you found it useful, and I hope very much that your readers do as well. It was a labor of love, it has to be said. You know, I thought it would. I had in my mind how long it would take to produce, and it took 4 times as long. But once I started, and I had kind of like the bit between my teeth, I didn't want to let go, and it really sort of started from a couple of things. The first was that around about 18 months ago, I wrote a report for a publication called What's New in Publishing,
yes.
50 Ways to Make Media Pay. Mm-hmm. And I realized that even though that report was very extensive, it's sort of 10, 12,000 words, there were a lot of ideas that I didn't necessarily get a chance to capture. And I also had in the back of my mind that several years ago, Josh Stearns, who used to be at the Dodge Foundation, is now at the Democracy Fund, had produced a list of 40-odd kind of ways that local publishers were monetizing. And I wanted to try and update that story. So I essentially clipped things as I went along. I kind of scribbled down notes, had a lot of things in my head, sat down with a draft that was 120 ideas with the intention of hyperlinking each one of those to at least a couple of different sources so people could kind of see these examples in action. And then I just disappeared down a rabbit warren of one idea, threw up 2 more, and then additional ones, and so forth. And I stopped when I got to 231. But I've had a few people get in touch and say, "Hey, you forgot about this thing, and what about this?" So I suspect we'll be able to nudge it up a little higher in the coming months.
So it's a working document. It's constantly evolving and changing.
Yeah, I think so, because the landscape is changing so quickly. I mean, what was really striking when I went back and looked at the list that Josh had produced maybe sort of 4 or 5 years ago was how quickly a lot of those ideas and examples didn't work anymore, or were out of date, or they just took you to kind of 404s. I actually had the same thing with when I produced that 50 Ways to Make Media Pay report. It originally started as an article. I pitched it as one article, and then it was like, oh, actually, I'm going to need 2. And then it became 4. And I was like, well, now I've written 4 articles and they're each like 2,000 words because I tend to write long. We should combine them and put them together in a single resource for people. And that had been put together over sort of a period of 3 or 4 months. And already I found that the material I put together in sort of parts 1 and 2 were already out of date because organizations had pivoted, had shut down, particular strategies or approaches they were doing, or the websites that you went to try and find examples about that had disappeared. So it is constantly changing and evolving. And I think as a researcher, that's what makes it interesting. But
Of
of course,
course.
publishers, that's what makes it challenging.
Well, okay, so we're going to make sure we provide a link to the current version. I found it in What's New in Publishing, but I'm going to get to this, and you'll find it if you're looking at the page where this podcast is on Editor and Publisher. You'll see a link to 231 ways publishers can make media pay, which brings up the topic of what you really do, which I find fascinating, is you just don't pontificate about journalism, but you take it to the next level. And a lot of your research is how it can be a business in a way. I mean, which it's an awful thing to say, but people have to eat, right? We're not a communistic society. So right now, the current methods that those news publishers look for to monetize their content are, subscription, which we're seeing some uptick right now, at least in the industry, thanks to COVID. Some people are, but it's not covering the cost of journalism by any stretch of the imagination. Advertising has yet to really cover that as well. How do you feel about the nonprofit world and what's been happening like in Salt Lake City? Are you following that right now, and how people are monetizing based on declaring themselves as a nonprofit news entity?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting trend, the kind of shift to non-profit status, and one that I suspect that we'll start to see more of. I mean, we know that there have been discussions kind of in policy circles about making that easier for organizations to potentially be able to do. There's certainly appealing characteristics with that, in that if you become a subscriber or you donate, then your tax dollars are tax refundable. So that's a good incentive for subscribers, for sure. And it potentially opens up different doors in terms of other revenue sources that you might be able to access. But I think one of the challenges then is it might open some doors, but it closes others. And so that's the sticking point. I think there's a perception, I think, perhaps amongst some publishers, that moving to non-profit status might be a bit of a panacea for some of the problems that they are facing. But actually, I think all that does is it limits some other things that you can do as a for-profit business. And so it's too early to say kind of, I think, what the outcome of this will be. But my observation would be that it's going to work for some organizations, but not necessarily for others. And you're going to need to think very carefully about if you're going to go down that route, because it may not be the kind of shining cathedral in the desert that you hope it will be.
Well, and then of course I call it the guilt approach, where you basically just pop up a window in the website and say, hey, I'm not making money running this newspaper, give me some money. And the contribution approach, we have been seeing some movement in that.
Yeah, and it's also really interesting to see how many organizations have started to take that approach, and perhaps sometimes in unexpected places. So for me, one of the obvious examples of that would be Vox and Vox Media. If you go to Vox's site, it's saying, will you support our explainer journalism? And here's ways in which you can contribute. And they are a for-profit organization, so your contributions are not tax refundable. They don't have a paywall or a kind of membership scheme. It's entirely sort of voluntary contributions. And I think it's interesting to see that an organization as big as that, one that's been seen as successful, is also going down that approach. So it wouldn't surprise me if we start to see this pretty much everywhere, that whatever your business model, there is going to be a box somewhere that says, hey, if you're enjoying this content, please contribute.
And of course, the major topics that we're hearing constantly now is this creation of news deserts that's going on. It's the cover story in our next edition of E&P, as we explore the tragedy that occurs in smaller markets and small areas that don't have a watchdog. Do you see hope? Do you see, obviously COVID's not helping the situation. What are you seeing out there now?
No, COVID is not helping the situation. And I think the biggest fear has to be that once jobs are lost in newsrooms, and once publications are shuttered as a result of COVID or kind of longer systemic trends, they're unlikely to come back. There have been a few examples of kind of reinvestment in areas, McClatchy, through the work that Mandy Jenkins is doing right now, is one example of that, but that's pretty rare. Generally speaking, once publications go, no one is really kind of sweeping in and responding to those community needs. And in turn, what that means is that communities are reliant increasingly on local television, which is still incredibly popular
But
as a source of news.
not every market has a local TV station that's
Yeah,
covering the local school board or the local police force
no,
or the local mayor, and that seems to be the challenge now.
yeah, and I think you can also argue, local TV news in some cases, does what it does very well, but it doesn't provide the kind of breadth and depth of reporting that you get in printed news. And there's plenty of research that says a lot of the stories that also end up in on TV and to some extent also in radio, they originate in print. That it's the boots on the ground of journalists in print newsrooms that tend to be the originators of a lot of original reporting, particularly at a local level. So the risk is that then is lost, and that communities either have to fend for themselves. You may have somebody in the community who then starts up a publication, and I'd be really curious to see whether that's something that we start to see more of. We saw a lot of that around the Great Recession. I can certainly talk, more about that. But I suspect more likely people will push people towards Facebook groups and other kind
Of course.
social network conversations, which are unfiltered and where it's very hard to understand, what is fact and what is fiction. And so that then starts to become very dangerous, I think, in terms of disinformation and misinformation and understanding, what you can trust, what's verifiable, and what's been filtered by expert journalists.
You said the word print 3 times. Let's discuss that. Do I need a press in order to be a newspaper in today's world?
No, no. There's a very short answer to that. I mean, I'm using that as a sort of
No, I get it. I
broad
can still
sweeping.
dial a phone. I mean, there's words out there now. You're physically looking at a page, but you're not. You're looking at a screen.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. But I'm just curious. You said print, but if, like, I live in Tampa Bay, Florida, my newspaper is supported by the Poynter Institute, and they've run to 2 days a week of publication. And they're still cranking out news digitally each and every day. So when you say print, what you really say is a local journalistic environment, correct? That is.
Yes, yes. I'm using that very much as sort of like a catch-all title.
Mhm.
Uh, but at the same time, I do think there is still a value in print. And one of the challenges that we know that many local news outlets are contending with is that print, even though we know that the trend lines for advertising are kind of been going like this for a long time, and indeed so has the audience, and so much of that has migrated to digital. 3-4 years ago, when I was sort of looking at the numbers of this, it was the print paper that was responsible for around about 80% of ad revenues at most local newspapers. So digital was only worth about 20. I've seen other statistics that have suggested it may be somewhere kind of in the higher 20s, but it is a fraction of the revenues. There is still something, I think, particularly for advertisers about a print product. There's a sort of a reassurance of seeing their brand in print. And we also only have to look at some of the ways in which organizations are trying to be creative around subscriptions. All of these subscription offers where you get the Sunday title for free. Take out the Monday to Saturday publication, if indeed it's running 6 days a week, which many former dailies indeed are not. Because of all the advertising that's wrapped into the Sunday, we'll give you that for free, because that is able to help fund the other days that are not so profitable.
Well, the data you're quoting, you may be referring to Dr. Iris Chai. Are you familiar with her report? She did it out of Austin, Texas, and they called it the inconvenient truth, not to steal something from Al Gore. But her studies still back up the fact that there's more reach and more revenue still coming from the printed product at most newspapers, although it's so darn expensive to cut down that tree, turn it into pulp, get it into paper, and get it distributed. Take it from a guy that publishes a monthly magazine, But
yeah, the distribution cost, I think, is the thing that really surprises people when they first look at this. That I know when I was looking at this around about a decade or so ago, around about a third of your costs were actually getting the print product, physically out there, and the percentage that's spent on editorial, a lot smaller than most people would expect.
It's very true, very true. All right, so the reason we're getting together, and I love getting lay of the land from different experts like you, is we all agree, and everybody agrees, that crisis accelerates change. Here comes COVID-19 out of nowhere. I mean, it reminds me of 2008. Remember that recession hit us very quickly out of nowhere. No one saw it coming, and impacted our industry so hard because it killed two massive revenue streams instantly, which were homes and jobs. And the days of those verticals, classifieds, whatever the heck you want to call them, are gone. They never came back. And that's why the big media companies were hurting, because they were relying on all that revenue for a century. Now here comes COVID-19, where we were feeling that pain we were just trying to find ways to monetize digital. And you're doing a study as we speak, supported by the Toe Center of Digital Journalism. Am I correct, sir? And
Yes.
what is the study you're currently doing? Explain it to us.
Yeah, so I'm currently a couple of weeks into a survey which is open at the moment for local journalists working at small market newspapers. And small market newspapers are ones that I've defined as 50,000 or less in terms of a print circulation. And around about 97% of all newspapers in the US fall into that category.
Definitely. No question.
And I started doing the work on this back in 2016, 2017, in part because I just moved to the US around that time, and I wanted to start to understand more about kind of local journalism here. That had been a topic that I'd explored a lot in the UK. And also because when I kind of looked at the industry press, I felt that so much of the conversation was about, here's what's happening at the Washington Post, here's what's happening at the New York Times, at BuzzFeed, Vice, places like that. And there wasn't enough of a conversation, in my view, about what was happening kind of on the ground at small market local newspapers, which make up not only the bulk of the industry, but also the bulk of the original reporting and the bulk of journalism jobs. So I ran a survey then, and this is an opportunity that what I'm doing now is a chance to sort of update that story. And what I want to get is perspectives from people who are working in newsrooms, from the kind of classic sort of mom and pop weekly of one or two people to sort of larger publications. Some of them might be in metropolitan areas, but a lot more of them are in sort of towns like Eugene, Oregon, where I am now, reasonable sized kind of college towns that have seen a lot of disruption to their media industry, but also whether the local newspaper in particular still plays a really important role in terms of watchdog and accountability reporting, in terms of reflecting the community back to itself, being a progression route for young journalists coming into the industry. And I want to get a sense of how is this sector changing? What are the issues that really, really matter to local journalists? And providing a forum and a platform to capture both that that experience in terms of what's changing, what are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities that those journalists can see. Because one of my frustrations as someone goes to pre-COVID would go to journalism conferences and so forth, if I could, was I didn't necessarily feel those perspectives were the ones that we heard. We hear from people doing fantastic work at a whole range of other publications, but there tends to be, dare I say it, a little bit of a circuit, and you tend to see the same kind of case studies and example and people speaking. And the kind of people I'm really interested in reaching and hearing from and amplifying their voice and their experience are people who never go to ONA or other types of conferences. They can't afford it, they don't have the budget, and they're also very conscious of, well, if I take 3 days off to go to Atlanta, who's going to put out the paper? Because it's just me. Or I go and that's a third of the team that has disappeared. And that is the reality at many of these smaller market publications. So I really want to be sort of an advocate for them, and also to use their experiences, their insights, the data that we get from them to inform some of the interventions that we're starting to see discussions around in terms of how we can support local news in the future, how we can prevent news deserts. And I think this is a really important conversation, but we need data and insights to inform it.
But you're really focusing on the journalist, not necessarily the publisher. You're focusing on the human being that is in charge of crafting the content. So even in some of these small markets, you may have a guy running that operation who is just basically doing the selling and paying for the content creation. It depends on who's running this. Sometimes the guy's doing everything, right? He's generating the content, washing the bottles, cleaning the floor.
Yeah.
But this is fascinating because I agree with you. I don't think we actually spend enough time polling them, learning their thoughts about the industry. We're so busy talking to the management.
Yes.
And their perceptions that you're actually going down to the. So it doesn't matter who you are as long as you're writing, correct? Correcting.
In part, but also, I mean, it doesn't have to just be writers. I mean, although you're right, a lot of the questions that are asked about are kind of more sort of journalistic intent. The survey is open to anybody who works at a local newspaper. So,
Okay, so
if you're the publisher, if you're working on the business development side, there are still questions that will be very relevant to you, because we'll be looking at things like, well, what are the new products you've introduced in the last few years? Have you introduced paywalls? Are you doing more with newsletters, with podcasts? What are your views about emerging platforms? I mean, it was fascinating a few years ago when we did an iteration of this survey. We were talking about augmented reality and virtual reality, and are these the future of journalism? And those were the conversations that were happening at conferences. The people I polled, and I think the way you described it as an opinion poll is an excellent way of describing it, they were not interested in this stuff in the slightest. And similarly, there was a really strong pushback. One of the questions I asked about was engagement. I said, engagement is this kind of big industry buzzword. There's so much discussion about it at conferences. What's your take on this? And people just, they were almost vitriolic in their responses. They just said, engagement's a term that's made up by overpaid management consultants. This is a term that is kind of flavor of the month now, but this is what we do, and we have been doing since day one, and we cannot survive without engaging with our community. So it's almost as if the kind of big metropolitans and national and international publications have had this kind of realization of, engagement is maybe something that we should do. Talk to the people in local news, and I was one of those people for many years. We've been doing that stuff day in, day out. You bump into your audience, in the coffee shop, at the school gates, whilst you're going for taking the dog for a walk around the neighborhood. And I think that is part of local journalism's secret sauce. It's part of what local journalism can teach kind of bigger publications, but it's also one of the reasons why, despite everything, I retain an element of optimism about the future of local journalism. And I think many local journalists, certainly from what they've told me in the past, do as well.
There's no question engagement now is on steroids, thanks to social media and thanks to the comments, and then you have the trolling going on. I mean, that's a new industry term, or whatever you want, another buzz term or whatever. Trolling means you're simply entering those environments and making people angry for an alternative reason. You're just using an environment just to get a reaction out of people, and all of that and more is simply, we were always doing it in the past. But now, thanks to the digital world, but I think COVID, or let me put it bluntly, it's not just COVID, it's 2020. This is a year that's not just a pandemic year, it's a year of just no unity. I mean, there's a constant battle, right versus left, Black Lives Matter. I mean, everybody's angry if you really think about this. And then the journalist has to be there and moderate this environment and report on it. It's going to be an interesting study that you're coming out with, and you're doing it right in the middle of this. What are your predictions? What are you feeling you're going to hear? I mean, I'm sorry, I asked you before the interview, will you give us an idea of what's coming in? Because this study ends when? When do you...
It ends... Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I'm so excited to tell you when it ends. Because it ends on the 30th of August, Sunday, 30th of August, 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. And then my hope is to turn around the results as quickly as possible, because I think there's something valuable in the kind of the currency of the data, and of something that is very, very topical. And my audience, the audience for my work, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, I'm not a traditional academic. I'm a professor of practice based in a university, which means that, my role really is to be a sort of conduit to industry, bring industry into education, and take my research out. And so the audience for this are the people who read editor and publisher. They're the people that I want to reach with these results, rather than kind of a more traditional academic journal. That has its place, but actually it's the people who take the survey are the people I also want to read the findings and the results from. And I want them to look at that and perhaps see validation for some of the work that they're doing, and also inspiration for other things that they might also want to do.
You understand that academia sometimes is a bubble. It's not the working industry. I mean, everybody is like, of course, we know that. Some people go there to escape the world. No offense. I'm not being judgmental, because you're not in a real world there. You're not making profit. You're not trying to figure out ways to drive a business. So you're kind of, that's what I love about your writing. And when I was reading about you, you're like a conduit to the real world in the world of academia. So now here's the questions. What are you feeling like you're going to learn during this critical study that ends very, very soon as you're polling the North American newspaper slash journalistic slash news publishing industry? What do you think, or what are you feeling?
Well, I think we're clearly going to see some of the impact of COVID. I've asked questions about what that has meant for the way in which people have worked. More homeworking, yes, but what we've seen is the kind of really sort of breaking down of walls around traditional beats. I suspect that we'll find that pretty much everybody's been working on some sort of COVID story because it has impacted on everything, be that sports, culture, business. This is not just the terrain of people who are looking at sort of health and science. This impacts on everybody. I suspect that many journalists will feel that they have not necessarily been adequately supported with making that transition because everything happened so quickly and overnight. The implications of that in terms of working from home, having to work in a very, very different way, but also if you are going out and about and still doing physical reporting, whether you have the right equipment to be able to do that, whether you feel you've had the training and support to know how you can do that safely. I suspect because this has happened so quickly, many journalists will feel that hasn't been the case despite the best efforts of their owners and publishers. And I'm also asking a lot of questions around trust. I think that this crisis has been, in very much in inverted commas, good for journalism in terms of reminding people about the important role that journalism plays, particularly local journalism. How do you take what's happening at a national and international level with this pandemic and translate it into what this means for my life day to day? What does this mean for me and my family and my community? That's where I think local journalism has done a terrific job during the course of this crisis. So I think you may well find that people that responding to this survey, their sense is that the public has more trust in journalism now than they might have done if we had polled them 6 months ago. But at the same time, as you rightly point out, there is a kind of wider reckoning taking place, across our society right now with the emergence of a new civil rights movement. And one of the questions that we're also asking is, how diverse are your newsrooms? Both
there
in
you
terms
go.
of
I was going to ask
employees,
that.
and in terms of the coverage that you are producing. I'm really interested to see, how are you trying to bring in disenfranchised voices into your coverage? Because I think that's much harder to do during a lockdown and during a pandemic. So there is there's a recognition that newsrooms need to do more of this, but that's hard to do when you can't necessarily meet with people face to face. It's hard to do under the pressure of working from home, and it's hard to do on deadline. I was really struck at the end of last year. I saw a great tweet by a journalist working for the New York Times who had done an analysis of all their stories during the course of 2019. Who had they spoken to? And the conclusion from this tweet was, if I'm not writing on deadline, I am much more likely to talk to a diverse range of sources. If I am on deadline, I tend to default to white men of a certain age in positions of power. And I thought that was a really interesting conclusion. And so actually one of the things I've started to do with my students was I created a spreadsheet, and I also saw one of my former students, Dalia Bazaz, who works at the Seattle Times, had also kindly shared this on Twitter. So it was great to be able to sort of show this as a real live example to my students, and said, okay, when you're producing a story, let's think about what are the different groups you want to have represented here, and let's track that so that you're not just producing a story that is kind of quick and convenient, but are you being truly representative of the communities that you are seeking to serve? And one of the ways that we need to do that is not necessarily intuitively. We need a method to be able to do that and track that. That always provokes a lot of discussion from students who feel that intuitively they know this stuff, and I think that's true, but whether they're putting it into practice or not is another matter.
When you're dealing with the youth that is trying to enter our industry now, where I hope you're being realistic with them and saying right now there's not a lot of jobs. And that's a bad thing in a lot of ways, especially through the consolidation, which you and I haven't even discussed. But the consolidation with the big hedge funds has stripped some newsrooms. You are aware of that as well. Do they feel hope? Do they still feel the passion? Do they still want to be? What are you feeling, at least in your academic environment, the kids?
That's a great question. I mean, I would love them to know more about the media economics. And because I'm really interested in that, I kind of do bring in the business side of things wherever I can, in part because I also think you need to understand the business model of organizations that you go to work for, because that influences the type of journalism and content that you produce. You also need to understand what are the trend lines that are coming in the future, so that you can try to future-proof your career and your skills, and be in the best possible position to take advantage of those opportunities as organizations, pivot or kind of move in different strategic directions. So I think that's really important for journalists at all ages to understand. But I really do try to instill that in young journalists, and that's something I've tried to also imbue in my own working life.
And they do understand what journalism is. It's not PR, which is where the jobs may be right now. Journalism is a different animal than spinning things on behalf of a business.
Yeah, and I think to your point about, do they understand this? Yes, they do. I mean, I think for me, one of the things that's been really striking, particularly since 2016, is to see a really strong sense of vocation amongst young journalists. The students that I am working with, they understand the economic realities of the journalism landscape. It is instilled into them, on a regular basis. When I bring in guests to talking classes, I get them to talk about what their day-to-day life looks like, how that publication has changed, how it continues to change. So they're very much going into the industry with their eyes open. But at the same time, they're really passionate about the role that journalism can make in terms of making a difference, of holding truth to power, of telling untold stories, of giving a voice to the voiceless, and all of those kind of cliches. But there's a truth to them, and our students, I think they really recognize that and buy into that. And at the same time, they know, well, if I want to pay off my student debts more quickly, and I totally get that, I can go and do a job in PR, and my starting salary will be twice as high. But will I have the same level of job satisfaction? Is this what I really want to do? And for most of my students, the answer is no. And interestingly, for most of my students, where they end up and where they actually want to go in the first instance is local newsrooms, where they can kind of really see the impact day to day of the work that they're doing, and where they recognize that this also acts as a sort of finishing school for many people, that you can learn from more experienced journalists. You might have a bit more of a safety net in terms of producing stories that are not quite so high profile, and that this still remains a potential progression route to larger newsrooms if that's what you want. But for many of those journalists, actually they think that where they can make the biggest difference is locally, and that's where they go, and I'm incredibly proud of that.
That's great. Well, Damien, it's been an honor. The airing of this podcast, we obviously pre-record them, will be 4 days before your deadline, which means there's plenty of time for local journalists or local publishers, anyone that's in the local publishing of news business, to participate in your study. And they find that at the Tow Center for Digital Journalism website. Am I correct, sir?
Yeah, actually they can find it via my Twitter. Perhaps we can post the link underneath in the show notes for this. If you go to bit.ly, bit.ly/TOW 2020, then you'll find it. So I used a bit.ly link to make that.
We all use them.
So it's bit.ly to find, and it will take you 8 to 12 minutes of your time. So it's not hopefully an inconvenient ask. I know everybody is incredibly busy, but the insights and experiences that I hope people will share with us will be incredibly valuable. And I'm really excited to share the results with you, Mike, and your readers.
We're going to definitely come back to this and write about it. bit.ly/TOW, TOW, which is the center, 2020. Take the 12 minutes. But before you go, you were complimenting me, or at least telling me that you're a big supporter of our Epi Awards. Coincidentally, our Epi deadline is 3 hours before your deadline, because it's 12 midnight, August 30th, Eastern Standard Time. You're an Epi judge this year, and thank you for devoting the time. Any words you want to say about anyone that thinks they should enter an Epi? Chris Hendricks will be the head of the judging this year. Any thoughts? Come on, tell them to enter that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate enough to do this a couple of years ago as well, and I loved it. It gave me a great opportunity to be introduced to a whole range of different news sources and stories that I otherwise wouldn't have come across. I actually used some of the examples that I was assigned to judge in class as a result. So this
Excellent.
was really great. There's sort of a nice virtuous circle there. But I think one of the reasons why the Epi Awards are so important is because of the way in which you categorize it, that this is not just sort of the Oscars for the biggest, loudest, brashest, best known publications and groups, that there are opportunities for every publisher, whatever the size that you are, whatever your area of specialism, to be able to enter and showcase your work. And what I saw before, and what I'm really looking forward to seeing again this year, is just fantastic, inventive, creative, valuable journalism happening at all levels across the industry. And we don't have enough oversight, I think, of those great case studies at a really local level. And so one of the things that the Epi Awards does really, really well is showcase great content that's happening at all tiers of the industry. And so if you haven't already applied, you've got about 10 days or so to do so. And I can't.
Oh, actually, yeah, I'm forward now but it's epiawards.com. And as I like to say, it's not just about winning an award, it's about sharing. And showcase, I like your word better, showcasing, but sharing your innovation with others is what this is all about as well. Get featured in the magazine as well and online. Damien, it's an honor. We're going to check back with you, of course, and write about the results of your study. And I want to thank you again for the fine work you're doing to help those that want to be part of our industry see the value of it on all dimensions, not just the journalism side, but the business side. That is so special. Thanks for your valuable time, sir. We were honored to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me.